Our retire early lifestyle is in peril. In this video, we're going to talk about which countries and how to tell which countries are infiltrated, and I use words like communism, but this day and age it may not be understood as what it really is, whether it's communism, fascism. It's all about how and where to keep our wits around us and be aware so that we can defend our liberties, which I call retire early lifestyle, because that's the kind of times we live in. We live in a FIRE world, F-I-R-E, financial independence, retire early, and all this kind of thing like that. And so we named our channel Retire Early Lifestyle. But let's not forget, without personal liberty, there is no retire early lifestyle. And so it's like foundational to our conversations. And yeah, we've been abroad for 12 years. We spent, and I have to say these things, I don't mean to bore our regulars, it's just that for the newcomers, you know, we've been abroad 12 years. We've spent 8 years living in Ecuador, and we've traveled the world, Europe and Central America, and now we're in Mexico. We're in the tropical Puerto Vallarta, which has beautiful scenery here. As you can see, I'll get to the whoppers. I do have whoppers for you. It's all about the infiltration. A lot of us know about the infiltration. We see it. But some of us maybe are suspecting, and others are just like, what are you talking about? And so there's a little bit for everyone in this conversation. And so I'm going to actually give you step by step, 1, 2, 3 signs of communist infiltration and how you can tell. Because listen, and you're going, yeah, I know what you're going to say, but listen. Communists don't put a badge on their shirt, whatever label, you know, communist, fascist, socialist. They're not going to put a little badge on their shirt and show up and go, hi, how you doing? I'm a communist. Nice to meet you. Yes, here's why you should believe in communism. That's not how they do it. And they don't do it, and they're not going to do it that way because they're nothing but thieves and robbers, and worse. But remember, these are only some of the techniques that they use. But I'm going to focus on, I'm going to group them in the most comprehensive categories, always with the understanding that all three of these categories rest on their foundations of lies and deception and stealth. Stealth is really important for these criminal-minded psychopaths because they don't want to be seen. Rather, they want to be seen as doing good while doing bad. So appearances and a cover story are really important for communists and fascists. And so that's why we always see this narration about, oh, it's good for your health. Oh, it's good for it's for your own protection. It's always for your own good. And so one of them is, the number one is feigning concern for your surroundings for your own good. And this could be weather, or climate change, or pollution. They're all part of the same thing, feigning concern. What I wanted to say, is this a statue here? Is he playing chess? I saw him move one of his chess pieces. Yeah, I knew it. He's a robot. So on the environment and surroundings and pollution front, they don't come out and say, oh, well, we're going to pollute. They say, a lot of times they don't say anything. But you can, and that's the problem. There's a conspicuous lack of news, and not always, sometimes there is a little bit of news. You just have to look for it. But it's not necessarily advertised. But once they figure out you're onto them, though, you might start seeing the occasional article saying that, you know, how polluted the bay is and how polluted the rivers are. And it's really suspicious because to somebody that's paying attention, like I am, and some of you are also paying attention, the first thing you noticed about when Venezuela blew up, because that's a whole other video, because Venezuela didn't really blow up. It had already been on a downward slippery slope for a couple of decades. People didn't know it though. But the locals did. A lot of them were fleeing and going to Miami way before Venezuela blew up in the news. But Venezuela, when it blew up, one of the things you noticed was that all of a sudden it's like, wait, all of a sudden all of the rivers were polluted. And the locals were telling you, so all the rivers were polluted, so you had no clean water. Imagine that. And they were polluted with all manner of stuff. Whether it be like over there in Venezuela, oil was super cheap. And so all of the rivers had all this oil in them. You remember those suspicious train spills in the Ohio River, right? Now, when you go look at the map, you might say, oh, conspiracy theory, but listen, that's fine, you can say that. But listen to this. Did you go look at the map? Did you notice how the spill was at the top of the river? Why couldn't it have been at the bottom of the river? The river goes all the way from Ohio, all the way through Kentucky and all those states down there, Arkansas. It's polluting West Virginia, huge amount of territory. And it was the same thing with that other suspicious spill in the rivers in Montana. Up in Montana, there's a lot of big, huge mountains that produce a lot of water and lakes, and then rivers that come from that, and dams. And so there's a lot of cities downstream. So if a bad guy wanted to pollute the water with one stroke of like dozens and dozens and dozens of cities, that would be the way to do it. And it's suspicious that both of those spills were at the very top. They weren't even in the middle. I mean, okay, so what? You want things to be totally 100% favorable towards your way of thinking, and the spills had to be at the bottom? No. Why weren't they in the bottom third? Why weren't they in the bottom half? Why weren't they in the top 60, 70%? No, they were at the top percentile, at the top 100%, 95% percentile of the location of the rivers. You see my point? All right, you tie that together with communist blow-up of Venezuela. All the rivers were polluted suspiciously, and the local was saying, so we couldn't go fishing. We had no way of getting any food. All of the mom and pop shops had been either closed or put out of business. Lo and behold, what do you know? The access to food was controlled. Oh my goodness! There goes that little communist agenda once again. Just little by little, you get rid of all the little pawns, like in a little chess game, and then to the unsuspecting opponent, which you and I are, we're the opponents. Those that love their liberty, and everyone else for that matter, even those that think they're on the other side. They don't understand, they're just being used. And so all of a sudden, it's like, checkmate. So you didn't see all of the little moves if you weren't paying attention. And then when you least are expecting it, boom, checkmate. Now they got you cornered. And that's what the guy was saying, the local in Venezuela, and a guy like me that's paying attention is recollecting that conversation from the local in Venezuela. And another one of the things was that the crime was completely out of control, and the property prices were, just when there's blood in the streets by property, it just fell down to almost nothing. So that's number one, is they feign concern for the environment and your health. Because when your water's polluted, well, guess what? We need to drink water, and if it's polluted, it's damaging your health. So they feign concern for the environment and concern for your health, while at the same time doing the exact opposite. I've been to a lot of countries now, and you see how 2020 has shown us how there is a concerted, associated, global association of this communism is global, and there's a concerted effort. And so you can see it to a person that travels, the same thing everywhere, the same playbook playing out everywhere. It's just eerie and just, I don't want to use the word scary, but it's only scary if you didn't know, and then you start seeing it, and it's like, oh my gosh, you're right. I mean, how can this be? How can it be that everywhere you go, it's the same thing? How can all these governments just dump sewage in their drinking water, in their bays, in their... How do they all do this? And most people don't know 2/3 of the world is endemic with that kind of thing. Okay, moving on. Number two is the normalization of mandates. Mandates. How many people think that mandates started in 2020? I'm in my early 60s, and some of the very first mandates that I experienced was when I was in my early 20s. In my early 20s, I experienced the very earliest of mandates. Like, we used to jump in the car just like the guy on Little House on the Prairie would jump in his horse and buggy and just go down the road. He didn't have to ask any permission to anybody. And he just did it. Those were different times. And that's the point. The normalization of mandates over a period of time, which is also known as incrementalism. And so how do you see this in these foreign countries? Well, again, the normalization is what, the communists aren't just going to come out. In normal, usually they're going to use stealth. And part of that stealth technique means using incrementalism, meaning so they're going to do one little step at a time so you don't notice it. And they're going to stretch it out over a period long enough to where you're going to be born into some of it, and that's going to cause you also to believe it to be normal in a certain way. And so I wasn't born with mandatory vehicle insurance. Now remember, these are the techniques that the communists use, and you and I both were born in a lot of these things that I'm talking about. And so I want to make sure that the viewer understands that the conversation is not about whether you think it's a good idea or not. So that we're not on the level whether the idea of the particular mandate should be. Like, I once talked to this lady that I showed up at her house, and the first thing she said was, everybody needs health insurance. Well, it could be that everybody needs health insurance, and it could be that everybody may want health insurance, but there's the rub. Everybody may not want health insurance, and therefore it comes down to personal choice and whether you have a personal choice. And that's the difference between what I'm talking about is a mandate doesn't give you a choice, and they want to give the appearance to be doing good for the collective community, and to say that everyone has to do this, and this is how they normalize it. Case in point, in Ecuador, when we first went to Ecuador, they didn't have mandatory health insurance. After we moved there, they tried to pass this mandatory health insurance, and guess who was speaking out against it? Yours truly. And was there anybody else speaking out against it? No, and that's a point of my conversation today, which I'll get to later in the video. So we were the only ones speaking out against it, not because there's anything wrong with having health insurance. So again, I just want to stress, the conversation's not about whether something's a good idea or not, because this is how the communists use deception and stealth to get acceptance. Because they get the population to a point where some part of the population believes it's a good idea, and that's all they need, is they need to get a certain part. Remember when they said that, you know, they just wanted to get 50% of the population jabbed, and then it went to 70%? Numbering for the purposes of taxing and regulating. And a lot of people, myself included, grew up in systems like that. And when you go travel internationally, you start noticing how not all systems are like the system that you grew up in. And that's an amazing thing, to be able to branch out away from something and see something and say, wow, this is better. There's more liberty. But when that situation actually turns and your liberty is getting encroached on, and communism is infiltrating, that's when you see certain things happening. And for example, you start seeing governments say and do certain things. Like, for example, the Ecuadorian government, when we first went there, used to be really easygoing towards foreigners. And I don't really want to differentiate between foreigners and locals, because we have to be careful not to get sucked into that trap, because if they're doing it to the locals, it's only a matter of time before they do it to the foreigners. You may feel like, oh, this is great, they don't bother foreigners. And it is great for a while, but remember, what goes around comes around. You know, eventually they'll just turn and get worse, and they'll turn on the foreigners. And so care about that. If it's happening to the locals and not the foreigners, that's not a good thing either. All that does is it just buys you some time. And so like the Ecuadorian government, not to pick on any governments, I'm just singling out certain scenarios for example purposes that are factual. And the Ecuadorian government was quoted as saying to the foreigners that we don't care if you've been outside of Ecuador for so much time or whatever, where normally you wouldn't be liable for taxes. They're now saying, we don't care how long you've been outside of Ecuador, you're still going to pay us taxes. Now, if that's not an arrogant, tyrannical position to take, I don't know what is. And that's a sign that you need to be looking out for. When governments make statements like that, it means something. It means they don't respect the rule of law. They don't respect their own laws, and they're going to disrespect your liberty. And you can't count on them to do what they're supposed to do in the law, and you can't trust them. And the Ecuadorian government was actually quoted as saying such a thing. And lo and behold, people like Lasso in Ecuador are calling on the demonic 666 FBI to come help them. What goes around comes around. When the criminals come into power, guess what happens? Bigger and badder criminals than you come after you. It's just the story of the bully that finally meets with somebody that's bigger and badder than them.
You said Lasso is calling in the FBI to help with what?
He's asking the FBI to help out because the gangs are putting a bullseye on the politicians, and they're scared. And they want the FBI, they want the help of the demonic 666 FBI, and all they're going to do is institute a numbering, a demonic numbering and taxing system of the people, because the FBI has no real way of actually doing anything. What they are is a numbering and tracking system that spies on people. The other thing, just to give you another example, is Mexico. Mexico is attempting to institute a statist numbering system similar to the USA. That's right, the demonic, statist, communist numbering of people, which is unbiblical. That tells you that there are communists in Mexico. Right now, they are infiltrating Mexico. And so I know of expats that have actually left Mexico over this very issue, and that's because these particular expats are aware, and they see these things and they notice them and they're gone. A lot of other expats are not as aware, and the purpose of this video is to help you be more aware of the ongoing attempt of communist infiltration in these countries that is happening to various degrees. I'm just helping you see some of the symptoms of it so that you can better understand to what degree it's happening in the place where you're in, and when you see it you can recognize it and then be prepared to do what the right thing. Because somebody might say, well, you look at what's happening in Canada, it's it's really bad, it's fallen to communism, I'm going to move over here. And then when you go over here, yes, the communism isn't as full-blown as Canada, but if you're not paying attention, it's right there in the background, slowly but surely getting rid of each little pawn in your liberty, to such an extent that eventually they'll just call a checkmate, and then you'll be cornered. And so I said that it was built on lies and deception and stealth. And so what do we do about these things? The wonderful thing about being able to travel and go and move internationally is that we can sometimes feel like, and I think that we can always do something no matter what level the communism is at. We can always decide to not comply, as President Trump said. But in some of these other places, the number one thing that dictators like to do is silence people and silence truth and information. And so we do the opposite of that. You put out information and you put out truth, and that's what these videos, that's why we make these videos. And the other thing that you can do is you can, any way that you can think of, any creative way that you can think of, where you can personally put out the truth with whatever method is available to you that you can think of in the place that you're in, do it. Don't just sit on the sidelines and do nothing, because it matters. Every little thing we do makes a difference. What do you think about all that? All right, so thanks for coming to the video, and have a wonderful day.